differently, as you can probably tell from the arrangement of the room. So Alex and I are going to talk about some of what we see as some of the emerging trends, or some basic concepts where there are some maybe different ways of going about it that are being discussed in the industry. And really, so I'm in the private consulting world. My name is Susan Lassel. I work with ICF. I'm based here in Sacramento. I've been doing cultural resources management for, I think, close to 25 years now. I know, it's very weird. Where'd all these gray hairs come from? And my background is historic preservation planning, so I'm a little bit more on the built environment side of things, but also deal with a lot of the archaeology issues that come up on projects. I've also worked back east, based in Virginia. I've worked based in Texas, in Austin, Texas for 8 years. I've worked across a lot of different of the transportation sector agencies, whether it's Federal Railroad Administration or Federal Transit Administration. So as we go through the 5 topics that Alex and I came up with, I'm going to sort of add that perspective from the private sector and from some other agencies, other transportation agencies beyond Caltrans. And so that's me.
Hello, my name is Alex Neeb. I am the statewide Section 106 coordinator at Caltrans, California Department of Transportation. I've been in this position for a few years, but worked in some of the other Caltrans offices in Oakland and in San Luis Obispo. And prior to that, I was working in the private consulting world and then also in nonprofit in San Francisco. So kind of covering all sectors in my background, but today, Susan and I wanted to talk about the different perspectives coming from both Caltrans as the federal lead agency for transportation projects, and then, as Susan said, from the consultant perspective. So we're going to kind of go back and forth through our slides and politely interrupting each other, and we encourage you to please also jump in whenever you have any questions or comments, because we'd like this to be more of a roundtable kind of discussion on these items. I know the majority of you are from the consulting world, so I'm hopeful that I can provide a little bit of perspective on how Caltrans is processing projects under Section 106, and what slight insight I can give to the State Historic Preservation Office's process for processing our transportation projects, so that you're able to take those perspectives home with you and apply them to your own projects as you're working with your private clients and with other local agencies. So first off, we're just going to give kind of a very brief overview of Section 106 and kind of Caltrans' role in Section 106. And also we're going to briefly touch on Section 4F of the Transportation Act. So just giving the framework of where we are and how Caltrans is involved in these different steps. Okay, so we're all professionals in this group, so this is old hat to all of you, but Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires all federal agencies to take into account effects. So you're probably wondering, federal agencies, what does Caltrans have to do with that? That's California. Section 106 here, we're going to be talking about identifying, evaluating, assessing effects, consulting to resolve effects. So Steve talked on most of these points this morning, but this is the regulatory framework that we're working under. Section 106 is applying to all actions carried out with federal funding. That's our number one kind of umbrella that we are probably going to get involved with. So any highway project or road project that has some sort of financial assistance from the Federal Highway Administration, whether it be grant money or whatever the funding source, will automatically trigger 106 compliance. It can also come from actions requiring any kind of federal license, permit, or approval. So this will take the form of Army Corps permits or Bureau of Land Management or U.S. Forest Service. Any kind of federal permitting that's required will trigger 106. Additionally, any actions carried out by the federal agency. So again, how was Caltrans involved? Since 2007, the Federal Highway Administration has assigned its NEPA responsibilities to Caltrans. So it basically delegated Caltrans to act on behalf of federal highways. So anytime there is a Section 106 nexus, The federal agency is Caltrans. There are a few certain examples, certain projects that remained non-delegated, that FHWA remains the federal agency, but those are very few and far between, and they're becoming less and less as those projects are becoming completed. So 99% of the time, Caltrans will be acting as FHWA for Section 106 purposes. And again, this is primarily taking the form of any project that has FHWA funding. So really is the money, is as long as it's coming from the federal government, Caltrans is going to get involved. Not specifically, unless there is an FHWA component. So if FTA or so Federal Transit Agency or Federal Rail Authority, if they have a role to play, if there is some sort of highway component, either FHWA funding or involves state highway system, then Caltrans will get involved. But if it's an exclusively rail or transit project, they will, then typically Caltrans isn't. But I say that now with a caveat of oftentimes there's mixed funding sources. So you could have a rail transportation project that also has some sort of federal highway money, so that in that regard, then Caltrans would get involved.
So here's my color commentary. There are more and more other agencies are trying to get delegated authority either as a whole agency or on a project by project basis. So for example, Federal Railroad Administration is currently in the process of working out the details to delegate authority, the federal authority, to the California High-Speed Rail Authority for all of the high-speed rail project. So you can have that similar scenario where the federal responsibility is delegated, and you are seeing that in other aspects of transportation planning as well.
Does the Caltrans PA allow other agencies to sign on?
Yes, next slide. The PA. Okay, so as Chad and as Steve referenced earlier, and I think Melissa as well, Caltrans does have a programmatic agreement. It has a very long title, the Programmatic Agreement among the Federal Highway Administration, Advisory Council, State Historic Preservation Office, Department of Transportation, for compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act as it pertains to administration of the Federal Aid Highway Program in California. We refer to it as the PA. So anytime you hear reference to the PA on a Caltrans project, this is what we're referring to. This programmatic agreement was established in 2004 and then was amended in 2014, so it is still active. It is a legally binding document that essentially outlines the guidelines and procedures for compliance with Section 106 for all federal highway projects. It is a simplified version of several 106 processes, but in terms of an agreement document itself, it is complex with many components. One of the things that Chad just asked a question about was, can another federal agency delegate Caltrans to act on their behalf? Under our PA, yes, they can. So the 2014 amendment included the Army Corps of Engineers as a signatory. So Army Corps of Engineers has agreed that all projects requiring 106 compliance can be deferred to Caltrans 106 efforts. Now, I see a lot of you raising your eyebrows. Whether or not they adhere to that is up for debate. It says that they can. It doesn't say that they have to. And different permitting, I won't get too into the weeds of this, but different permitting units, 404 versus 408. 408 is explicitly called out as not delegating, where 404 is. So it's a very complicated thing. But yes, they have the ability to delegate Caltrans. They have the ability to delegate Caltrans as and RPA does allow for any federal agency to do this as long as it is federal highway money. So if, let's say it was a project on Forest Service land, but it was a state-only funded project, they could not delegate Caltrans as federal lead. It has to be a federally funded project to use RPA. So that's a very kind of complex nuance of it. And we're just going to talk about kind of the basics, but most of you have probably used the PA and applied it in a certain project. So let's absolutely get into kind of more complex topics. Susan and I wanted to make this more of an advanced topics conversation. So any other questions about the PA, I'm happy to answer. Just to give you some brief background, Steve touched on this morning on his presentation, but there is an entire listing of exemptable property types, which means these are property types that in consultation with Advisory Council and the SHPO have been identified as unlikely to have significance. That doesn't mean that you can write them off completely at all times if there are extenuating circumstances that could elevate one to a level of significance. These are things like minor ubiquitous roadside infrastructure like benches and fencing and things like that. It could be culverts, it could be abandoned rail segments, it could be a lot of different things. There's a whole laundry list of them. There's also a component of our PA that allows for what are called screened undertakings. So this comes into play when you have a kind of a minor project, something like pavement overlay, where through consultation it was identified that certain scopes of work have a really limited potential to affect. And so in those regards, you can identify it as a screened undertaking and you do not have to complete, that counts as your 106 consultation and completion efforts. There's also, I meant to bring this up during Steve's presentation, so I'm glad to have an opportunity to do it, is we also have an exhibit in our guidance that identifies certain types of work that should qualify to meet the Secretary of Interior standards on bridge projects. So it's things like certain material replacements and certain minor works we've already identified as, yep, check, that meets the standards, no problem. So something that's very helpful as you have a bridge rehabilitation project. It's exhibit 7.4 in our environmental guidance. So something to reference if you're ever doing a bridge project. The PA is, like I said, it's a complicated document, but it really allows for a streamlined process, ironically enough. But it still meets all the steps of 106. It establishes our undertaking, defines our area of potential effects, helps you to identify who the consulting parties are, identify historic properties, evaluate them, assessing effects, and resolving effects. Okay. Usually this consultation effort, if it rises above a certain level of effects finding, you'll start off with your Caltrans district. There's 12, so depending on where your project is located, you're going to be working with and submitting your projects to different offices and different staff. And we understand the frustration of working with different perspectives. We try at our headquarters office to maintain a certain level of consistency throughout all projects, so sometimes consultants and local agencies will be frustrated at the number of reviews that go through with a Caltrans project, but that is to help ensure consistency in what you're being told, the standards that things are being held to. That is the role of the headquarters office here in Sacramento. But each of the 12 districts have their own professionally qualified staff to review the cultural resources technical studies. So once those are submitted, it then comes to the Caltrans headquarters office, and then we act as the liaison with the State Historic Preservation Office. And then just to reiterate with local assistance projects, so projects off the state highway system, you may think, oh, we're not on a Caltrans highway, we don't have to worry about this. If there's even a single dollar of federal funding, and usually this takes the form of grant matching through FHWA, then it is subject to 106, and it does come through the Caltrans district offices. So it is also subject to 106 requirements, but can also take advantage of our programmatic agreement as well. I'm going to very briefly talk about 4F. It is a complicated law that if you are even the most seasoned Section 106 practitioner, if you have not been involved in many transportation projects, it can be somewhat unwieldy to kind of wrap your brain around and figure out how it intersects with Section 106. So it is part of the larger environmental process under NEPA, and it does overlap with Section 106, but it is a separate parallel process. So something to keep in mind that while a lot of your Section 106 efforts can be applied towards your 4F finding, they are not the same thing. Ironically enough, the two acts were signed on the very same day. The Department of Transportation Act, which holds Section 4F, and the National Historic Preservation Act were both signed on October 15th, 1966. Obviously a reflection of the time and the culture of protection for historic resources. And I mean, there's a lot of things that you can think of that were probably influencing these decisions, the Interstate Act, just in general preservation momentum throughout the country. So they both are geared towards the preservation of resources. And that at the same time, though, Section 106 is a consultation process that requires basically conversations to assess effects, whereas 4F is a requirement for the transportation agency to select the alternative that does the least harm. So it does actually require you to select an alternative, whereas Section 106 is a consultation process. Section 4F, I should clarify, only applies to federal highway funded projects. So that's the difference. So for example, if you had an Army Corps permitting requirement, yes, DOT projects, yeah. If you had an Army Corps permitting project or permit requirement that was your 106 nexus, that would not automatically trigger 4F, even though Section 106 would still apply. I'm sorry, this is not the most glamorous topic, but we'll push through and then leave it open for questions. I don't have as many pretty pictures as Steve did, unfortunately, but we'll get through it. Okay, historic sites under 4F are one of the properties covered. It also concerns parks, wildlife, and waterfowl refuge. So the concept of 4F is there a use? This is a really kind of 180-degree approach from Section 106 where we're assessing effects. The very first question you have to ask with 4F is, how is the property being used? Is it being permanently incorporated into a transportation facility? Is it a temporary occupancy of the land? So something like a construction easement is required, but it's not permanently acquired and it will be restored. Or is there a constructive use, which for layman's terms is basically just indirect effects as opposed to a physical impact. So it is entirely possible to have an adverse effect under 106, but no use under 4F, and vice versa, to have a non-adverse effect under 106, but a use under 4F. So 2 examples. The one on the left is a train depot. This was an example where the 106 worked to make an ADA compliant. You can't tell from this picture, but it's just, it was something that required ramps and elevator access that was determined to be an adverse effect to the historic resource. However, there was no permanent incorporation into a transportation facility, so there was no use under 4F. The reverse is what happens more often, where no adverse under Section 106. Here's an example of a large rural farm property where the buildings were the contributing elements, and the project required a right-of-way take, so there was a permanent incorporation of a small sliver of land. So it was a use under 4F, but not considered an adverse effect because it did not affect any of the character-defining features of the property. So they happen in parallel, but they don't always have to be the same finding at the end.
Question? Yes. So have you had a situation where you have a historic road, and I guess it depends on what the historic boundary is, but would there be a use there if you have if the project didn't have any right of way, you wouldn't have a 4F?
So I've seen projects before where the idea is whether you're incorporating an historic property into a transportation use that wasn't previously, right?
So unless you're like incorporating like a county road and elevating it to state highway or something like that, you really wouldn't have a use.
Right. So, and that's, I think that is another
or if you have a abandoned segment that you might be obliterating, then that would be that problem.
Exactly. So just defining space, I think, is the biggest hurdle in doing a breath analysis. And because of the sort of three-tiered process where in defining use, and then you get to constructive use, which often I tend to get a lot of debate about constructive use, but then you go like to the FHWA and they say that, you know, it's incredibly rare that you end up with a constructive use. And so I think just knowing that and going in, assuming that, and trying to convince other people of it, that, you know, the bar for saying that there is a constructive use is really, really high. So don't waste a lot of time debating it.
Yeah, and agreed. And so speaking for Caltrans, it is incredibly rare to get to, I think maybe it's my next slide. Yes, the different types of findings of 4F. So 99% of the time, if there is a use on a historic property, it will end up as a de minimis finding. De minimis is basically anytime you have a no historic property is affected or no adverse effect, you're automatically going to have a de minimis finding. There is another element of a temporary occupancy that you can claim for, but it's just much easier to, that's now all pretty much captured under de minimis. That's kind of the, not official policy, but procedurally what always ends up happening. A programmatic 4F is kind of the other next step up. If you can't qualify under the de minimis, if you don't have a no historic properties affected or no adverse effect finding, then you would likely be bumped up to the programmatic. There's a programmatic for historic bridges. So basically you would apply the programmatic to your 4F analysis. And that pretty much states that you have looked at 3 alternatives: the no build, build a new structure at a different location while maintaining the existing bridge, or rehabilitating the existing bridge. Those 3 alternatives need to be included in order to use that programmatic. But that's kind of the highest level that you'll probably ever engage with in a 4F analysis. The next level up is an individual 4F, and that's when you have an adverse effect and there's no feasible alternative that would avoid that adverse effect. That's an individual. They're very rare. They don't happen that often. Like I said, 99% of the time it works out to be a de minimis finding, or the programmatic can be applied. So I wanted to touch on 4F because it is unique to transportation projects, but it is something that as cultural resource practitioners, you're probably not going to be involved with at a very detailed level, aside from just providing information to a general planner. I'm going to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the reason that individual 4Fs are so rare is not because projects don't have that level of impact, that level of effect. It's really because we try so hard to avoid them. And it's not just the cultural resources people who want to see it avoided. The project engineers, the project proponents do not want to have to go through the really laborious process of processing an individual 4F. And so the project proponents, the engineers, will work really, really hard to find ways to avoid that particular use. And so where that comes in for us preservation professionals is really to understand how the resource is being adversely affected and identify the ways to avoid that, because it could be the most minute change in how the project is interacting with that resource that could take you from adverse effect to no adverse effect. It could even be your consultation process and just, whether you got off on the right foot with SHPO through Alex's office, of course, in the case of Caltrans. But, with FTA or FRA, a lot of times the cultural resources professionals are that, front line in the negotiation, the 106 consultation process. And so really getting to that no adverse effect becomes the goal. So a lot of us have not processed individual 4Fs because, and the reason, of course, that you try so hard to avoid is not just the process of filing the 4F, but the fact that the agency is required to demonstrate a really high bar of there being absolutely no prudent or feasible alternatives to the one that would have the 4F impact.
Yeah, and that's just reiterating kind of that difference that I was trying to highlight earlier of 106 versus 4F. 106, you can get to the end of your 106 efforts and still identify an adverse effect and the project moves forward. That's just the process to make sure you've left no stone left unturned on coming with alternatives and talking to interested parties. 4F requires the agency to choose the alternative of least harm, which is the most prudent and feasible alternative. Yeah, Chad.
Question. We've done one programmatic 4F, and my understanding of Caltrans that the review and approval stops at the district head environmental whatever. There's a title for the person, so it doesn't go to CSO, it doesn't go to headquarters. Am I correct?
If you've used the historic bridges 4F, usually the programmatic 4F for historic bridges is applied when there is an adverse effect.
Right, but it doesn't go to CSO.
Well, so this is a good point. This is a great point. Thank you for bringing this up. So the way that 4F is actually processed with the State Historic Preservation Office is because the 106 process is so much parallel to 4F up until the effects finding. The 106 consultation with SHPO will include a statement in the letter that says, with your concurrence on 106, you are also concurring on the finding under 4F. So you're correct in that it doesn't actually have a separate process that goes to Caltrans headquarters and then to SHPO, because it's all captured in the 106 process. There isn't, yeah, it's not exactly a set process, because again, the 4F identifies the agency with official jurisdiction. And so for cultural resources, that's the SHPO. We've already engaged and consulted with the SHPO during 106. Yeah, so that once you've gotten to that's another great point, thank you. Once you've gotten to an individual 4F analysis, it has to go to the Department of Interior. It's not just it goes to the California SHPO and you're done. It goes to the Department of Interior in Washington and they have to get involved. So it's a big deal. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of coordination, and which is, to Susan's point, everybody wants to avoid it because it takes so long. And that's for all 4F resources, our 4F properties. Parkland, wildlife, whatever it is, it goes to the Department of Interior, and it just becomes a time black hole. Yes, but to the point of reviewing it, because the 4F in an environmental document lives in a different section than cultural resources. Even if the 4F use is to a historic site, it's captured in a different section of your EIR, EIS. So Caltrans is involved to the point of reviewing that EIR, EIS, and then we were the Caltrans headquarters was the point of communicating to SHPO that we have determined there will be a use, and here is how it's going to be captured. Yeah. Yes.
Is there an appeals process for like there is for 106?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. I don't think there is, because it's even though it's a similar process, there's the only people making the 4F decisions are the federal lead agency. So it's not like you need SHPO concurrence or anything like that, or even DOI in concurrence. Right. So the federal lead agency is the one who makes the determination. So if you have a transportation project, Caltrans or the locals are both the federal lead agency and the project proponent. So the appeal would be to themselves.
Hold on. But so Caltrans is the federal lead agency under NEPA. Right. And under 106, but 4F is a part of the Department of Transportation Act. It's not actually part of NEPA, it's just often put in the NEPA document. So really, Caltrans would not be the lead agency, FHWA is. So going around Caltrans to FHWA seems to be the only appeal.
Right. And yeah, I mean, a lawsuit could certainly come from outside parties. Absolutely. I think that's the appeal process. I would say that if you are working on behalf, or if you are the project sponsor, there's no appeal to the SHPO, for example. And thank you for clarifying that. That is a big difference, that Caltrans, even as they act as FHWA under NEPA delegation, FHWA at any time can take a project back. So it's difficult, it would serve no purpose for Caltrans acting as FHWA to argue with FHWA over a finding. But I could see absolutely, to your point, that an outside party could file a lawsuit on the finding. But I know what you're talking about with the appeals to the SHPO and things like that. But no, they're not actually involved in the 4F decision making. They're just notified as the official with jurisdiction. It's very similar, than these tiny little branches that differ between 106 and 4F. So it is complex. And again, you probably will never have to deal with it, because 9 times out of 10 it will be a de minimis finding and you can just move on with the project. Yes. Right. Yep. And I will say that because it happens so infrequently, and the law is constantly evolving with case precedent and things like that. You may have done a 4F analysis 10 years ago, and then you get to it now, and it's a completely different beast. So it is constantly evolving how it's being processed and handled, both at Caltrans and at FHWA. So it's something that people are always kind of working on to streamline the process and clarify in how we do things.
Yeah, one of the most current clarifications is actually coming out of a project in Southern California, and I want to say it's actually related to the 710 freeway, which has been going on since the mid-1950s, trying to figure out how to fill this 4.5-mile gap of the Pasadena freeway. So another thing that I'm bringing insights from right now, I spent the last 2 days in Denver at a conference of the Transportation Research Board's Committee on Historic Preservation and Archaeology. So this is where representatives like Alex from DOTs all over the country come together to share recent lessons learned or emerging trends and to identify potential future research needs. So one of the things that came up in a discussion about 4F was actually something that's happening here in Pasadena, where they thought that all the potential 4F impacts had already been discussed. Again, this has been going on for whatever that would be, 50 years. And they keep figuring out new things that are continuing to stop that project. But this one in particular had to do with a school property, so not an historic resource issue, but the fact that they were talking about tunneling, taking this 4.5-mile stretch of freeway underground rather than going through the neighborhood that has been really stopping the project these 50 years. And they thought that the tunneling would be a great option, but it just got challenged, basically saying you haven't considered the potential Section 4F impact to a school at the surface level due to the possibility that that tunnel might fail and the school could, yeah. So, and it's an interpretation that's being taken very seriously by FHWA to the point where it's now a new way of needing to think about Section 4F, so it's, the very slim possibility of something to happen much farther down the line time-wise, or maybe not. I mean, it is California, earthquake country. It's not so far-fetched, right? But it's just kind of interesting. And so the Federal Highways Administration, the resource centers that they have really taken this under their wing to figure out whether this is now a new consideration under Section 4F. So I think these FHWA resource centers are also a player if it comes down to complex issues, and if there is the sense that you want to challenge them somehow, to pull them in for that national perspective on how FHWA wants 4F to be interpreted, so that it's not just a local state level interpretation.
There's a quick question online asking why the school is a 4F resource.
That is, that I don't know personally, because I did hear from people who have been arguing it and then trying to figure out whether it applies to other projects like major rail projects here in the state. That has been a really big question, and I don't know the answer. I haven't looked into the case. Ooh.
Not to this one specifically, but this has come up before with schools and public parks. So if the park component of a school, a playground, whatever, is available and open to the public, that has been interpreted that qualifies as a park for 4F. So I think that's probably where that came from.
No, and this one wasn't. This one wasn't.
Yeah.
Experts that testify to the probability of a tunnel failing.
Challenge whether it's a 4F property. I mean, that would be a challenge. Because if Federal Highways makes that interpretation, it becomes part of the right.
But and who would be wanting to challenge it? Caltrans, if they want the project to move forward, and that's probably not going to happen.
I think it'd be tough.
Yeah, we would have the interest. Caltrans has the interest in getting the project through, but they don't have the interest in challenging it.
I think this one keeps coming back to the criterion P.
It's been going over 50 years.
Yeah.
Everyone's used to it. It's not.
Do you think they're looking into the future of all those boring, projects that are planned by Elon Musk and there's other companies that are, I don't know if those would be under the jurisdiction of USDOT.
That's funny you mention that because Shippo asked us the same question because of one of the Elon Musk projects out in DC. They said, wait, the Hyperloop. They're like, wait, that's going to be similar to what's going on here. Yeah, and so that's the question is Caltrans going to be involved in any of those? Yeah, I think it would be more level.
Oh, yeah.
Right, it would be more kind of encroachment permit and that kind of situation. Okay, we have identified a few other kind of more advanced topics that we want to. Unless there's anything else that you'd like to discuss about the PA or 4F?
Actually, I have a question. I apologize. It's just one of those things that we've been discussing it before, and I really like to get clarified. So section 4F, I'm sorry, section 4F. Oh, section 106 and 4F, there we go. They run parallel most of the time, but 4F in the historic properties world is inherently informed by the results of the section 106. So you have to, theoretically, finish the section 106, the finding of fact, at the very least, the finding of fact and whether or not you can do it in minutes. You have to finish that first before you can go on to getting 4F compliance, correct?
I don't think it did. And we still have the microphone on.
Okay. Yes, that's correct. Because the 4F can be going on concurrently in terms of is there a use and answering that question. But you're correct in that determining what level of 4F evaluation is required, you have to have your effects determination to make that decision. Yeah, because if it is no historic property suspected or no adverse effect, then you are allowed to use de minimis. But if it rises to an adverse effect, you can no longer use de minimis. And that's where well, I shouldn't say that. It's not that you can no longer use de minimis, but it's unlikely that you would qualify for a de minimis finding. But you can't make that determination on what is an appropriate level of evaluation until you know what your effects are going to be. Unless you know, unless your project is a historic bridge replacement, then you kind of know that you're going to move up to a programmatic. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Linear resources.
Okay, so this is something that I'm sure everyone has been grappling with a lot lately. We actually had a large session on this at our Caltrans Cultural Resources Functional Workshop in October, because we as Caltrans Cultural Resources specialists are also grappling with this in kind of a changing climate at the State Historic Preservation Office and what they're expecting out of documentation and effects analyses for linear resources. Chad's going to talk about this in his talk later, but we're just going to talk, just kind of get the tip of the iceberg here in terms of what is the baseline of what's required in submitting these types of resources. So when we're talking about linear resources, this can take a lot of different forms. It could be a transportation resource like a road or a railroad, a water conveyance, aqueducts, canals, ditches, pipelines, utility resources such as transmission lines or pipelines, earthwork resources such as levees. So a few examples here, we have the Central Valley Water Project up in the upper left. We have a Sacramento River Delta levee that was preached. It's a disappointing picture. The Transcontinental Railroad, Niles Canyon. We have a transmission line out in the desert, and then we have the Big Sur Carmel San Historic Highway, which is open officially today. Yay! Very exciting news. So these are all considered different types of linear resources. When considering them for projects, what do we need to know? Avoiding evaluation in isolation. What does that mean? You're not looking at just the portion of the resource within your area of potential effect, but thinking more holistically. A context. Not every road is historic. Not every road is historic. Not every canal is historic. So you have to provide a really comprehensive context to understand. This goes also back to Steve's earlier presentation on why is something significant. If you can't say every bridge is significant because it's a certain type, likewise, you can't say every railroad is significant just because it's associated with rail expansion. Otherwise, everyone would be. So establishing an appropriate context for each type of resource, determining the types of resources that would be associated, because there is going to be various typology involved. Integrity, what level of integrity is needed to convey significance of a resource when you're talking about something that's such a larger scale than an individual building or bridge or archaeological site. And then what contributors would be considered for that larger resource. We've established kind of with the SHPO that they appreciate a sense of hierarchy and inventory for a resource. A good example of this is indeed the Carmel San Simeon Highway. Go back to the picture on the lower left there. That's a 72-mile highway stretch. It's a historic district. But that evaluation and documentation established, Steve, were you involved in that one? It established several different, established several different types of resources associated, ranging from the iconic concrete arch bridges, which there are 7, and were determined individually eligible, and then ranging down to rustic stone masonry parapet walls and retaining walls, and then down to culverts and culvert head walls. So by establishing that hierarchy of over 200 contributing elements, we were able to establish a more comprehensive effects analysis whenever there are projects, because impacts to one of the bridges, for example, would be considered a much more detrimental effect than impacts to an individual culvert. So always keep in mind that, while you don't have to establish kind of an official list of most important to least important, grouping them categories in a type of evaluation hierarchy can help with linear resources.
So we finished doing a cultural landscape evaluation of Market Street in San Francisco, basically from the Embarcadero to Octavia Street. And in the process of doing that project, the reviewer who was at the city at the time and who actually ended up coming to work our San Francisco office really established that she wanted to evaluate it as a landscape. So rather than a district, rather than a structure, which is what a lot of roads and streets have been evaluated under, up to now. And the really nice thing about the historic landscape evaluation structure is how landscapes are meant to be looked at per a couple of different pieces of National Park Service guidance really gives you those categories, those buckets to put different elements of the roadway into, and then to come up with a prioritization about which characteristics are most important in conveying the significance of that street or roadway as a landscape, as a design plan. So there's an option for folks who are looking at evaluating historic roads or resources is to use the landscape construct.
You mentioned that also doesn't tie you so much to the direct historic fabrics.
It gives you more flexibility, so you still are tied to historic fabric, but not exclusively the way you might otherwise be. So there's a lot more about vistas and identifying those sort of visual relationships as well as almost the emotional relationships that you have with the landscape. I'm definitely not an expert in this. New enough to manage the project and to be a peer reviewer of the result. And it's one of these things that I will fully admit, having been in architectural history and historic preservation planning, I have spent a decade or so thinking I knew how to evaluate landscapes. And then when I saw this particular study done and the relatively recent, like in the last 5 to 7 years, new guidance coming out from the Park Service, and I don't just mean the National Register bulletin, but guidance that's out for the parks to use in their own landscape resources within parks, national parks. It's a very different way of looking at the physical environment and categorizing it and breaking it down so that you can then build up a different kind of argument. And I feel like I'm still just barely scratching the surface of understanding the concepts behind it. So I think we really do have a newer discipline within cultural resources management that, whether it's the archaeologists or the architectural historians, we've all been pretending we knew how to do those resources, but there is a unique value to somebody who that was their training all along, usually from a landscape architecture background. It's distinctly different.
Yeah, that explains my question to Steve about the alignment of roads and things. It is a landscape. My father is a landscape architect, what I grew up with. He worked with state parks, with historic landscapes. So I think that is part of it, how you look at these resources in their sites and how they were designed to look at their sites. Landscape architecture.
Right. One of the categories is circulation,
Yeah.
right? And another category might be features and distances.
Well, and that goes back to also the integrity discussion, that your thresholds for integrity and your levels of integrity are going to be a bit more dynamic if you're talking about landscape components, because we're talking about things that are evolving over time and changing over time, such as circulation patterns and topography and things like that. So that goes back to the point of what level of integrity are you discussing for the resource as a whole and for the individual components that are within your project area, because those are potentially going to be very different. So I'm going to use an example, the Central Valley Water Project, and we're going to use this as a framework for linear resources and how they're both inventoried and assessed. This is a picture, sorry. So this is one that has been done, started probably 20, 30 years ago, and is constantly updated over time because it is continuing to change and be updated. And this is also an example of a project that while Caltrans often gets involved, it is a huge majority of it is owned by Bureau of Reclamation. So you're talking about several different federal agencies being involved in the decision making. So going back to the concept of hierarchy of components, it was established early on that some of the most critical components of the entire resource were the storage structures and power plants. So we're talking about dams, power plants, and dikes. There are several, but a handful. So when you're talking about contributing elements to this resource, there's probably well over 100, and these represent a handful of them. So similar to the Big Sur bridges that I was talking about earlier, these are unique, going back to Steve's point of rarity, resource types within the larger linear resource. So they were identified as one of the most critical components. The actual water conveyance itself, this is a resource that is significant under criterion A for water conveyance throughout the state of California. So the canals themselves play a huge role in that significance criteria. So different types of them obviously are going to be operating at different scales. You have the main canals, and then you have lateral and sublaterals, the different types of drains and water management systems. But the questions to keep in mind is what makes these types of structures important contributors to the larger resource? How do these smaller scale things like laterals and sublaterals fit into the eligibility? If you were to alter one or have an effect on one, would that be an adverse effect to the larger resource as a whole? And then what types of effects could occur without having an overall adverse effect to the resources as a whole? Pumping plants, on the other hand, are ones that are fewer and farther between, so they would play a more significant role in the significance. They also have oftentimes have an architectural design component, so there could be potential criterion C considerations for these larger structures. And then you have really small things, fish facilities, pipelines, utility lines, and crossings. There are several bridges, gosh, I don't even know how many that go over this, I forget off the top of my head, hundreds of crossings over the California aqueduct system. So some of them have been determined historic if they're from a certain period of significance. Ones outside of that period of significance were determined not eligible. And then there are also outbuildings associated. So that hierarchy categorization can help when determining effects. Okay, so I want to kind of try to provide a lens into the current thinking of SHPO. They're not here, obviously, so I'm not speaking on their behalf. I'm just saying our Caltrans interpretation of the guidance that we've received from them. Their preference is to assume eligibility for the larger resource as a whole, if there is an appropriate context under which to assume it eligible. That goes back to my earlier comment of not every railroad is historic, not every canal is historic. There has to be a justification, but they also are not expecting, a small canal crossing project to evaluate the entirety of the California aqueduct system. That's beyond the scale and scope of that project. But to understand that there is a potential significance in order to move on to that next step of assessing effects. Our next little mini module will be on assuming eligibility, so I won't get into it too much, but that is the preference that SHPO is taking if there is some suggestion of larger significance for the resource as a whole. Exceptions to this kind of approach, yeah, Chad can talk to that part. Properties previously determined eligible. If it was already determined eligible, especially larger segments of it, go ahead and use that eligibility determination to, or either build upon it to say this section would also be eligible.
Would that reasoning also apply? So you have a large linear resource, say your project is small and it's affecting a very small portion of it. So you assume eligibility, you don't assume significance, you assume eligibility. That doesn't make it eligible, you're assuming eligibility for purposes of that project.
Yes, correct.
So would that fall into that first bullet category?
Yes.
For the next project?
No,
Okay.
no.
That's why we have a whole separate module.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll talk about that because that is a kind of a nuance. But no, assumption of eligibility is for that one project only. Yeah. So that bullet, that sub bullet, that first sub bullet there is for projects where there has been, let's say you have a long railroad segment that has previously been determined eligible, and you're now have a project that's only affecting one small piece of an adjacent portion. If the majority of the large linear resource has already been determined eligible and the context already is established, you're basically just evaluating integrity of the remaining segments. Yeah, they don't want you to just kind of defer to later by assuming eligibility. You have the information available for that larger resource to do it. And then Route 66, there's so many, Chad's gonna speak to Route 66 later, but there's so much existing documentation that SHPO really doesn't want to see assumption of eligibility for Route 66. They are also in the process of establishing a programmatic agreement for Route 66. So that's a whole other thing we will also be talking about later. And then also segments of linear resources so altered that it no longer represents the significance of the larger resource. So this comes up a lot with canals, that if you have a larger resource and the segment that you're talking about is so altered and all the other segments that have previously been evaluated are also altered and determined not eligible, why are you assuming eligibility for the whole? If every previous study and your study is saying that this segment, this small segment, is not eligible, what would be eligible then, if nothing, you know? So that's kind of where the hiccups are coming with once SHPO established this guidance of assume eligibility, move on to effects. Then they started getting all these submittals of, we're gonna assume eligibility of this canal that 90% of it has previously been evaluated and determined not eligible. So why are you assuming it eligible then? So there has to be some sort of logic behind the decision making.
I got a question. Your office has guidance on ditches, water conveyance systems, and you have guidance on historic roads. I think that's about it in terms of linear features. Is there another set of guidance?
So Steve is referring to the historic archaeological research designs that Caltrans established, that are basically historic context and methodologies. There's a water conveyance, there's historic roads and trails, there's mining, which has some linear, but not really, agricultural, and then recent past
those two that are clear.
Yes.
Has that ever come up in discussion that you have worked, pretty hard to develop a methodology for evaluating? I just haven't done about the roads and ditches because I work with them, but the ditches and evaluate the roads. Has that come up? Because this seems like this is throwing those two out the window.
It's not necessarily throwing it out the window. I think that the SHPO, and again, I'm not speaking on their behalf, just my interpretation of what their guidance means. They are pragmatic. They don't want to see, they don't expect a full evaluation of a large linear resource for a small scale project. So even though the context may be established and a methodology may have been established through those hard studies, they realize that a small local assistance project for a bridge rail replacement is not the appropriate vehicle to do a large scale assessment like that. What they are hoping to avoid is segmentation, is evaluation of this small segment as eligible, not eligible, so that they have a whole bunch of little tiny segments that have been evaluated, but it's never been looked at as a whole. That's what they're trying to get away from. Yeah. Okay. I don't know how much. Oh, okay. And then for effects, going back to the earlier conversation, what makes it significant? What is the integrity of the segment within the AP, but also the integrity of the resource as a whole? And what effect will the project have on the characteristics that make it eligible? How much information is needed? It depends. It depends on what already exists. It depends on the scale of your individual project. It depends on if there are character defining features within your project area. It all depends. So I wish I could say, here's the process, here's a template to use for every linear project, but they're all going to be slightly different depending on the resource and depending on the scope of work, unfortunately.
So we have 3 more topics that Alex and I did discussion presentations around. One is to go a little bit deeper into assumptions of eligibility, pros and cons of that. The other is to talk about PAs, MOAs, and mitigation. and we got a snooze on that one already from one member. And then the fifth one is to talk about 2 nationwide exemptions that apply to transportation planning. It occurs to me that we are at 2:30 with this session, meant to go to 3. So,
It's gonna take a full 45 minutes, so if you need an extra 15 minutes. for
Okay.
this session, keep flying.
okay, we will keep plowing through them then.
We'll go through the MOA PA one very quickly.
Or we'll let Chad have a nap.
Yeah. Yeah. You need to go get coffee during that time. Did anyone have any questions about linear resources? I know a lot of consulting firms are working on them, especially in the central part of the state.
Caltrans, there's a form out there for character defining features, like some type of matrix and
Let's talk about that.
And I know that was developed and it's not required. What's your perspective on, sometimes it does make sense but it's kind of a laborious kind of.
Sure.
Yeah.
That form is not required at any point. If it is helpful, by all means, please take advantage of it. It is not required, and it is not something that we are looking for in order to.
Can you see them very well?
No. And they were used, I think they were really established, especially in context, I think out of the 710 context of large scale surveys. If you were to do a large scale historic district survey, they could be helpful. And they are very helpful if that's the way that you gather information and that's the way you synthesize that information, they're available, but they are not required. And they're just an option. It's just another tool.
Helps make design decisions.
Sure.
The way it's set up.
Sure. It helps as long as that information is captured in the document in whatever format that may be, narratively, graphically, however it is, that's all that matters. Yeah.
I worked a lot on historic streetcar systems. A lot of the rail for those systems are still subsurface in San Diego. What I've spoken with some of the folks at SHPO, but haven't really got too far with it. The best way to record those types of linear resources are in more networks rather than a single line, like a transmission line. And also, what occurred down there is, as well as other parts of Southern California, especially, are that those systems are cobbled together. So if you're recording a 4th Avenue line, well, that might be part of 4 different places. So does that record it? How do you record that? Trying to come up with a system that assists those coming behind us and hitting that linear somewhere else to not have to redo all the work. And to also keep in mind the context of that, line and the process.
Well, and I think you hit on just another aspect of why this is so challenging and why it deserves it, one of 5 complex topics to talk about today. I think the same can be said for canal systems. They are systems, not just one linear canal. And same for the heavy railroads. We've heard of reviewers at SHPO who have said that let's just assume every single piece of rail in California is eligible and go from there. We've heard, an argument that I really like that comes from some of the folks at JRP Consulting is let's look at the, do you remember what they call it? The, like basically the founding lines, just, the original lines, and what's, still left from them, not all of the derivative lines. And so it requires a lot of work on the context to begin with, and they've done quite a lot. And so there's a lot of debate. And then I've also, working on as much high-speed rail as I am, I'm encountering a lot of different resource types. And, it's been like 7 or 8 years now that I've been working on it, and others for even longer than that. And so thresholds that we established for water conveyance systems at the beginning of doing the documentation for the Merced-Fresno section, which was the first to make it sort of all the way through all the hoops, was completely rejected by the next section, and they evaluated water conveyance systems totally differently. Now we're evaluating them, you know, in yet another project section, and we have come up with a pretty elaborate discussion. Like the first 2 rounds, it was professional opinion based on experience, right? But it wasn't spelled out. And so in the current documentation, there's a much bigger effort. There's like 4 pages of spelling out what the registration criteria are that we're using to evaluate any little canal crossing.
Are these 3 different firms that did these? Or is this kind of a refinement of the
it's a refinement of the thought process, because each of the ones I just referred to, there were different firms because I've moved firms, but I at least was a common factor. And then most recently, we even had, you know, the 4-page registration criteria thrown partially out the window because SHPO came back and said, oh, by the way, Bureau of Reclamation just came up with their own registration criteria for, you know, for one particular irrigation district, and the idea of main canals versus lateral canals, and lateral canals can be seen as not contributing, but all main canals are significant, you know. And even the idea of then what do you need for integrity? You know, a lot of people still apply, oh, well, it used to be earthen and then they lined it in concrete, so loss of integrity. Well, no, that's definitely not an accepted criterion anymore. It's what a lot of people are using is a 3-part test. One, that it's in the same location it was originally, so same alignment, that it continues to convey water, and that it has generally the same kind of setting it did originally, so usually an agricultural setting. And otherwise, the physical materials could have changed 100%. And so, you know, you've got all these really different things out there. And one thing that I've been hearing pretty consistently from SHPO, because we had similar cases with historic roads where, you know, a previous project section evaluated a stretch of the same roadway as not eligible, and the high-speed rail authority is now being required to treat it as eligible because Caltrans had made a finding in the meantime that they wanted to consider that roadway eligible. And so what SHPO is saying pretty consistently is defer to the agency whose resource it is. So if it's an historic road, defer to Caltrans if they've made a finding. If it's a water conveyance system under Bureau of Reclamation, defer to the Bureau. If it's a railroad, defer to FRA. If it's a local transit line, probably defer to FTA. So that's also something to take into consideration if you're working on a rail project. You're not going to just be looking at what FRA has deemed in the past. You need to be looking at what the other agencies, what findings they've made about resources that are quote unquote theirs. I thought that was interesting.
And the public disagree with those statements.
Yes, yes. There's always criterion P. I love it.
So is this part of this module?
Probably. I may have gotten ahead of us.
No, I mean, that's a different concept that this is. I'm just going to talk about the practicality of how to go through the assumption of eligibility for Caltrans projects, because this is unique to the Caltrans PA. This is not across the board for all transportation projects. This is a stipulation in the Caltrans PA only. So this is only applying to Caltrans projects. So we'll dive right in. So Section 106 obviously requires this good faith effort to carry out appropriate identification efforts. Obviously, it is not always practical to evaluate every single potential resource within a project area. We do our best effort to do so. And in a perfect world, we would be able to evaluate everything just so that we have that knowledge base. But as a taxpayer agency, we cannot do that for every single resource that we come across. We've made a huge effort. Steve referred to the Caltrans bridge inventory. I'm sure everyone is well versed in it. But the bridge inventory established five categories ranging from not eligible to listed in the National Register. It, at this point, has evaluated every bridge constructed through 1975. So you're pretty much covered. That's both Caltrans and local bridges. It was a windshield survey. There was some in-depth evaluation of a number of bridges, but for the most part, it evaluated a typology. And therefore, there are several bridges that have been identified as Category 5, meaning not eligible. I shouldn't say several, a handful of bridges over the past maybe 5 years or so that individual districts and individual projects have relooked at. So it is the bridge inventory is an inventory, but it is not set in stone. It was a survey that was concurred with by the SHPO. So these are determined eligible or ineligible resources, but like any other previously determined ineligible resource, during your ID and eval stage, you would still take a look at that bridge again just to double check that there were no circumstances that would require reevaluation, because there are a handful that have been reevaluated as now eligible that were identified as ineligible. It was logistically and physically impossible to individually evaluate every single bridge in California. Certainly things that have criterion A or criterion B significance may have been missed during the inventory. And so those are things that can be captured in your individual projects. That's not saying you need to reevaluate every single Category 5 bridge in your project. That's unrealistic and unnecessary. It's just to always keep that in the back of your mind of there is potential. Yes.
So who at Caltrans sees that? Most of the time they just say, no, there's no HRI required. What's the criterion for somebody to identify?
Okay, Margot's talking about local assistance projects. When they come through, they submit a form to Caltrans, or Caltrans submits a form back to the local agency saying these are the anticipated technical studies that are required. It's before any of them have been submitted, obviously, so it's a very kind of windshield quick look at what the project is proposing. Caltrans professionally qualified staff, so architectural historians and archaeologists, quick look at the proposed project and any potential red flags that they may see. If there is a Category 5 bridge in the project area and they've identified it as requiring reevaluation, presumably they've done that first step that you would do as a professional of looking at it visually. Is there some sort of visual component that may have been missed that could potentially qualify under Category C or Criterion C? Or sometimes they were misclassified as Category 4. A lot of railroad bridges were classified as Category 4. Category 4 means needs further evaluation. So things that they just didn't have the capacity to individually evaluate. So that may have been one that may have been a reason why it's listed as needs reevaluation. It's up to the kind of the Caltrans PQS staff to decide why it would potentially need it. But it's the same criterion you would apply to any resource that needs reevaluation. Time has passed, so there's new information, consideration of recent past resources. It shouldn't necessarily come to something like that because the bridge survey has been updated through 1975. It would just be perhaps they're familiar with the individual bridge from another project and they know that there's some other context. It's hard to state specifically, but they're doing that. They're basically taking that first step that you would have done as well.
It's been checked to not dig with the HRER, but we know that there is some context behind the bridge, let's say, and it should be reevaluated, but it hasn't been identified.
So for you as the consultant to say that we think that something is required that Caltrans didn't identify? Yeah, I'm not sure how that works in terms of the local assistance programming, that whether or not that has to come from Caltrans or if it can come from presumably you're the client, your local agency is the client. So if they're on board with paying for additional studies, I don't think Caltrans would reject that.
Yeah, I think this definitely is an emerging issue. There's gray area around this, and what Margot's asking opens up a discussion of that gray area. Our office has had projects recently where the original PES form said no additional bridge investigations necessary. There were other things that needed to be looked at, but it identified Category 5 bridges that didn't need to be looked at. It took long enough to get to where the HPSR package actually went to the district for review that something happened in the meantime? And part of the comments back were, why didn't you confirm the ineligibility of the historic bridges? And you know, our lead author was like, because it's a category 5 and your PES said so, you know. So I think you know, for the consultants, we always are walking this balancing act, but I think at least informing the lead agency and the project proponent that there is a recognition. I think there always was a recognition, but maybe it's just there's more awareness more broadly at the district reviewers, at the PQS level. There's more of a recognition that the bridge survey was an inventory, and that it looked, you know, mostly at sea, and that some ideas about especially mid-century designs are changing as well. So even if it was evaluated under sea, our current filter for importance under sea is also evolving. So, you know, just to have that conversation with them about whether you think that it needs a little bit more attention, let them measure the risk of, you know, putting in documentation and it coming back saying more work is needed, but at least then you've had that discussion and there's some awareness that it could continue to be something that needs to be looked at in more depth.
The consultant who might have a research on the better idea of the context of that might have that.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And so I think the scenario that you're describing is, well, frustrating probably from your perspective, is ideal from the Caltrans, as opposed to the reverse of requiring documentation that isn't actually necessary. That's what everybody wants to avoid. I think it's just a situation that was happening a lot was people would see category 5 and just say, check, done. And they wouldn't look at them at all. Or they would classify it under, you know, no cultural resources present. And so the idea was, okay, well, that's not quite accurate. There are cultural resources, they've just been determined ineligible. Have you spent 5 minutes just looking at what they look like now to confirm that that is still an appropriate finding, like you would for any other ineligible resource? And that wasn't happening. So I think that's going back to your point of when people were saying, well, did you consider the eligibility determination? Is it still valid? That wasn't happening for a while. So that's where that's coming from. What Margot was describing of you as the consultant identifying a need for additional study, that's great. I mean, I think that, to Susan's point, sometimes the PES is done 5 years before it actually gets programmed, or you know, gets shelved, or something happens, or they don't have the capacity to have as much detailed information as you might. So I think the actual programming of how is that getting paid for and how do you convince them, I think that's more between the client and the consultant of whether or not it's appropriate to prepare that documentation if Caltrans doesn't require it. But they'll never, you know, send it back to you and say we don't want to see it if you found more information because we didn't check that box. You know, it's going to be one of those things where we're working together to find out the answer there. Sorry, that probably didn't answer your question. Okay, so assumption of eligibility is, like I said, a part of the programmatic agreement for Caltrans. There's kind of 2 stipulations here. The first one is very cut and dry. It's for archaeological properties. If an archaeological site can be protected in its entirety by an environmentally sensitive area establishment, then you can assume it eligible without doing any subsurface testing, move on. The purpose there is to avoid any damage to archaeological sites unnecessarily. If it can be protected in its entirety, you can assume it eligible without doing any testing or evaluation and move on with your project. If it's a documented, recorded site, yes, sorry. The second stipulation is more what we're going to speak of today, which was an addition to the 2014 PA. So you're probably all well versed in it now, but it was relatively new a few years ago. This is a huge time savings under the PA. So while it may seem like a few hoops to jump through, it does actually save a lot of time in terms of evaluations. This allows for properties to be assumed eligible if there are certain circumstances that kind of limit the capacity for its evaluation. So those are things like restricted access, a large property size, so that's what we're talking about with the linear resources, and limited potential to affect. Just making it very clear, and this is more a point, I have it in my notes, this is from an internal Caltrans presentation, that time and money are not special circumstances to assume eligibility. Just because your schedule is really short or you've run out of money on your contract does not mean that you can assume eligibility. So just making that very clear. So the process with this is that it actually comes, I don't know if I have this later. Okay, I'll talk about that later. Just give you a couple examples. This is the Desert Training Center down in San Bernardino County. This is a project on State Route 90. There was several projects on State Route 95 that crosses the historic boundary of the Desert Training Center. It's in the Mojave Desert. It's a 28,000 square mile property. So evaluation of it as a whole is not practical for a small shoulder backing project or guardrail replacement project. The project that I'm using as an example was adjacent to 2 individual features that were potentially contributors to this district. And so it was assumed eligible because it met both the requirements as a large property, but then also limited potential to affect. A small scale project, minor project in a 28,000 square foot or square mile property, there's really limited potential there. So they were able to assume it eligible and move directly onto the effects analysis. Oh boy. Oh, great. Okay, so this is and the DTC is also interesting because is this BLM? I think it's BLM land. They did an evaluation of the entirety and did an inventory and everything like that. It's just never been concurred with from SHPO. So it's one that the context already exists. The potential contributing resources are already known. So it's a really kind of a slam dunk assumption of eligibility. It's not our property, and the property owner of BLM, for whatever reason, are not interested in having it determined eligible at this point. So it was easy to just assume eligibility for the purposes of the project only and then move on.
One of the big problems down there, is that just outside Desert Center, to the west of Desert Center, where originally part of Camp Young, back in the 1980s, somebody reported about a 5-mile long by 1-mile wide area where there were some 3 or 4 features within that were rifle range. So now that's what we call a hot dog. 5 miles by 1 mile, and that's a site boundary. Anything that occurs in there, we have multiple 500 kV transmission lines running there. It's right along the side of Highway 10, and it is now permanently in the record as a site.
Don't you wish you had a PA with assumption of eligibility stipulation? How much that would help, right? So this really is meant to be a time-saving measure. It's not a way to skirt your responsibilities, but a way to save time in those kind of circumstances. Okay, a second example, real quick, the BART system in the Bay Area. There was a project in District 4 where there was going to be a trail project that essentially was going to go underneath one of the BART overcrossings. Since technically it crossed the APE, it was a resource within the APE. Obviously, there was no potential to affect it because it was a trail underneath 2 of the piers, and there was no potential for even indirect effects. It was a large resource size, and so it was assumed eligible so that they could move directly onto the effects and state that there was no potential there. Another example, also in the Bay Area, is the Vallecillos Nuclear Center, and it is obviously a secure facility. They could not get access to record it. However, it is associated with the pioneering phases of nuclear power plants. So it has already kind of a known context that they were able to determine. And because they were not able to access it to formally evaluate the integrity or record the individual resources, they assumed it eligible under a known context and were able to move on to the effects finding, which was a no adverse effect because there was a road project not even visible in this picture. So very easily to determine that there's no need to access the property. They could move on to the effects determination. So logistically, how do you do that? As a local agency or the consultant or Caltrans district staff directly. They submit a request by email to the Caltrans headquarters office where we review it to make sure that it meets those certain types of circumstances. A small amount of basic information has to be included. What is the potential significance? Under what potential criteria would you be assuming it eligible? And what is kind of an assumed period of significance? At first, when we started establishing these guidelines of how to do this request, people responded with, well, how do we know that if we're not evaluating it? What's the purpose of doing this if we have to still come up with that information? Again, this isn't a shortcut. This isn't deferring your responsibilities. It's saying, basically accomplishing the same amount of investigation and identification and evaluation just without that formal step of sending it to SHPO. You're saying, we know that it would potentially be historic. We just can't get that last step to get all the information we need for it. So we're going to assume it eligible and for this project only. So you're not really shortcutting anything. You still need to provide us with the context of why it would be eligible. And this is to help justify your effects analysis. How can you have a no adverse effect finding and by saying that the resource can still convey its significance with the project if you don't know what the significance is, if you don't know under what criteria it would potentially be significant? So again, it's an effort of streamlining the process so that you don't have to evaluate large resources or ones that you physically cannot get access to, but you're still establishing the same level of effort.
Do you consider the relativity boundary issues so you know the relative size? I think that would help in assessing effects too, because if you're maybe at a periphery of a very large resource in which the significance would lend itself and the resource is very uniform, and it's going to affect very small amount of data. So is that one of the items that you'd like to see in there as well?
You know, at the time of the request for assumption of eligibility, you don't even have to get that far because this is really at the stage of ID and evaluation. You're not even at effects yet. This will influence your effects, but we don't need to know what your effects analysis is going to be. Yeah.
Whether some type of relative idea of how large the property is.
Oh, yes, yes. Okay, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, something like Desert Training Center, for example, when they send in the request and say it's 28,000 square miles, I mean, okay, we know right there that it's going to be a large resource size. It doesn't have to be exact. You know, the BART system, I think they just said it's, you know, so many miles worth of track. And that's enough to kind of understand the scale and the scope of how large it is, yeah.
So two thoughts here. One, almost despite what you just said about you're not even at effects yet, is it safe to say that assumption of eligibility isn't used very much when you are actually heading towards an adverse effect? I mean, because adverse effect has to go to SHPO, right? Whereas no adverse can stay at CSO.
Under certain circumstances. Sometimes no adverse effect also goes to SHPO. So yes and no, but that's why you need to have some context, right? Because you have to be able to make that determination of effects. If you know, see, it's hard to say. I would say generally, yeah, in concept, that makes sense, right? But if you have restricted access, you have restricted access and there's nothing you can do about it. We've had projects that have had an adverse effect on a historic property that was assumed eligible because they couldn't get onto the property to evaluate it, but they knew it was going to be an adverse effect because of a large, so the example I'm thinking of is down in LA County, in rural LA County on Highway 138. There's a large mansion property that had a huge, like 20-acre front yard, essentially, that was had a designed landscape as the front yard. The highway it was a huge property, something like that. I may be using the wrong numbers, but a huge property in front. And the highway project was going to be widening the highway. There was a lake or some body of water on the other side, so it had to go in towards the historic property. They were going to be taking, you know, over an acre of it or something, of the designed landscape. They couldn't get onto the property to evaluate the house or the building, but they knew it was going to be an adverse effect and they had to assume it eligible. And then once they get access, they'll do further determinations of all those character defining features and things like that. So it's generally, yeah, if you know you're going to have an adverse effect, you've already gotten all the information you need. It's really the restricted access thing that can throw a wrench. Yeah. Okay, I think that's pretty much it. I think I just repeated this last slide because it does depend how much information we need always. But again, this is just a step to get towards assessing effects. And it is a way to help you when you do end up in those unique circumstances that a full evaluation is not possible. John?
Question online, how does an assumption of eligibility apply to evaluating features that might contribute to the report?
Oh, great question. So again, the assumption of eligibility is unique to the Caltrans 106 PA. So if there is a potential for F use, then it's probably not the appropriate path to take, because you are going to have to do that full 4F evaluation. So let's say you're going to have a linear resource, for example, that will have some sort of 4F use and require a 4F evaluation. You are going to need that information. So yeah, it is unique to the 106 PA. It does not automatically transfer to 4F. Similarly, this may be going down too much of a rabbit hole here of regulations, but if you're talking about Public Resources Code 5024, which is state-owned historic resources, assumption of eligibility does not automatically then list it on the master list. It is unique to this project only that you're talking about. For purposes of CEQA, for that project only, yeah, because it you're identifying it as potentially eligible, so it's identified essentially in a survey, your individual survey, yeah.
But it doesn't apply to 1524 just because it's a temporary thing.
It applies to 1524. I'm saying it doesn't get then listed on the master list. Yeah.
Right, well, and it's also an extension of the idea of for this project only. So it should not be treated as eligible on future projects, even future Caltrans projects, which is one of the downsides of it, because that does happen. But I would contend that's a good thing, because it's only meant to be used for the purposes of this project, and it shouldn't burden all future projects, because it's very project specific why you are using this, because a lot of people are using it as a shortcut, for better or worse. And on a future project, maybe that lead agency, maybe that local, even if it's another Caltrans project, maybe they can get access and they could get in there and do a full evaluation. That would be better for the resource to have the full evaluation.
Or they have the project scope to do a full evaluation of a large resource or something. Right. I mean, to the Desert Training Center example, I think that that district requests assumption of eligibility for Desert Training Center every couple of months for different projects, because they have so many projects that go through it, but are in a situation where they can't get concurrence on the eligibility, so they just keep, even though it's the same resource, it's a different project, so they have to request it again a second and a third time.
Some have required different levels of mitigation. What's down there now, SRI did a really full context on 2-volume, one on the California side and on the Arizona side. One of the large solar projects now they recently required that as part of mitigation, they do a film which is shown at the Patent Museum here at the west entrance there. And so that BLM SRI solar farm film is now what is shown there. That's part of the required mitigation. So there's a lot of different stuff going on there. Individual projects, which is as it should be.
Going back to one more angle on the Section 4F question, another reason that assuming eligibility isn't going to get you where you need to go is that if the proposed project looks like it's going to have an adverse effect, and so you're looking at a Section 4F impact, that needs to be, you need to explore all alternatives to avoid that. You need to know more about the resource, because a new project alternative that goes in a very different location than the proposed one, you need to, and it's a linear resource, and then so the resource keeps going. You need to know enough about the resource to know whether the avoidance alternatives would impact the resource.
Any other questions? And again, Caltrans specific. Okay, we are going to talk about memorandums of agreements, programmatic agreements, and mitigation. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. It is a bit dry, so I apologize. But you're talking about agreement documents here. So I'm going to skip through the actual process as quickly as possible and get to mitigation, because I think that's what people really are interested in and kind of curious about, and hopefully can speak to the climate at SHPO and what types of things they have seemed to be receptive to or deemed inadequate. So very quickly, definitions of the two and the kind of the differences between the two. A programmatic agreement, this is appropriate when you're unable to complete the ID or evaluation steps, usually because of restricted access, or the finding is unknown, usually because of multiple alternatives that have yet to be a preferred alternative selected. And so an agreement document is required. The quick and dirty kind of formulaic way of differentiating the two, a PA is when it's unknown resources and or unknown effects. An MOA is when it's known resources and known effects. So an MOA would be, you know what the resource is going to be and you know it's going to be an adverse effect. Here's how we're going to mitigate for it. A PA is, we're not sure what's going on yet, so we're going to outline a process to make sure we are in compliance with 106. That's really the key differences there. There are two types of PAs. There's a project PA, so that's specific to an individual project where the effects are unknown or the resources are unknown. The other is a programmatic PA, a program PA, which guides the 106 compliance for either an entire agency or a specific historic property. So the Caltrans 106 PA is an example. The Route 66 PA is another example where it's unique to that specific resource as opposed to an individual project, and will outline how future projects on that resource are processed. So there's kind of two different types there. A memorandum of agreement is a document that will define how the adverse effects are going to be resolved. So it outlines who the responsible parties are, it outlines what the loss is, and then what's going to be done to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those adverse effects, and who is responsible for implementing those measures. So right, the first questions are, how do you avoid, how do you minimize, and how do you mitigate? Those are all things you want to be included. So if you are able to ESA and protect certain resources, that's captured there. If certain things can be handled meeting the Secretary of Interior standards, you would still capture those conditions there. And then you would talk about how to mitigate adverse effects. So it is entirely possible to have an adverse effect on a project that requires an MOA, that you're then also ESAing certain resources, or certain other resources will be rehabilitated to the standards. This is usually on large-scale projects that have multiple resources at play. So this is all determined with consultation with your consulting parties. And again, let's see if I'm going to go into these details. I'm not, but consulting parties do not necessarily equal concurring parties. Those are two kind of different concepts. Consulting parties means all folks that you've consulted with as part of the 106 process. That's how you can assess effects and figure out your treatment measures. The concurring parties are folks who are going to sign on to your PA saying that they have been participating in the actual, or PA or MOA, that they have been participating in the actual formation of the agreement document. The signatories on an MOA are going to be your federal lead agency, which in this case is Caltrans as FHWA, and SHPO. And then there's another subcategory of invited signatories, which is anyone else with a responsibility. So that could be a local agency if you're working on a local assistance project. It would be the Caltrans district who's responsible for that project. And it would be then any other landowners. So if there's Forest Service or BLM or National Park Service or state parks, they would also be a signatory. That's other agency public landowners, so not every single private property owner that's impacted by the project. That's not the case at all. It is Caltrans' procedure to have tribes as concurring parties as opposed to invited signatories, unless they have a responsibility under the agreement document, or unless it is going through tribal lands, in which case they would then be an invited signatory. That's getting really down into the weeds of the nitty-gritty of who does what, but just wanted to put that out there because that does seem to be a point of confusion for folks. Yes?
A question about the Route 66 PA. Does it, I mean, I was aware that.
It's still in draft.
So-
Don't worry.
So specifically, Caltrans, BLM, in San Bernardino County, or?
It is all agreement documents are officially between Caltrans and the SHPO. Potentially advisory council can be involved, but then the other folks would be invited signatories because they have responsibilities. So I believe that one is a huge document. I was just using it as an example. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's the county. I believe there's a transit authority. I don't remember everybody else.
That really got spiked off by bridges.
Correct.
So is that growing beyond just bridge replacements?
It covers a wide scale of things. So this is a program PA, and so it covers a lot of different things of future projects that come up, how they're going to be processed, and this helps a lot. There's also a Feather River Highway PA. There's a Big Sur Highway PA is under draft form. The idea is that there are certain types of resources that you're going to encounter in these larger resource areas, and how can you handle them efficiently? So, for example, the Big Sur PA. That is going to be drafted up. There are something like 150 culverts that are contributors to that historic district. If you had to go through SHPO consultation for every single time you affected one of those culverts, I mean, you'd be going to SHPO once a month. So it's identifying steps that, going back to those hierarchy of contributing features. So the Route 66 PA will do something similar, where it's identifying certain activities, certain resources that can be exempted, but kind of in line with the Section 106 PA, just unique to that resource. Yeah. Okay. What is treatment? Treatment is the same, in this respect, treatment equals mitigation. The treatment measures are your mitigation measures. So how we resolve an adverse effect. I really want to talk about creative mitigation because this has been a big sticking point with SHPO, and we want to make sure that as projects are submitted, we're going in with as much kind of creative mitigation backup as we possibly can, so it's not kicked back to us over and over saying that it's inadequate. There are 4 kind of key points that they keep making over and over. There has to be a public benefit component. The old way was kind of Habs hair documentation or data recovery for archaeology. Those things get drafted up, put on a shelf, nobody sees it ever. And I think that's a really good point that their office is making, that there has to be it's a public loss of a resource, so there needs to be some sort of public benefit to the mitigation. It needs to be publicly accessible and publicly available. So that's a big component. There has to be a direct connection to the resource's significance. You can't have a historic bridge demolition and then say you're going to survey recent past track housing as mitigation. They have to be connected somehow. It should be commensurate to the degree of impacts to the resource. If you're going to be doing a historic bridge rail replacement project that has an adverse effect, it would be unreasonable to, require a survey of, we've already done one, but a survey of all the bridges in California, for example. It should be at a level of what the effects are. So you can have kind of a sliding scale of adverse effects from minor, something kind of on a lower end of like a rail replacement to complete bridge demolition. So you're going to have different mitigation kind of depending on what the scope of that impact is. And then really key, this is really key if you take nothing else away from this module, mitigation must be developed in consultation with stakeholders. Mitigation cannot be the agency, Caltrans, the local agency, whoever it is, coming up with the idea, telling stakeholders this is what we're doing and sending it to SHPO. There has to be a back and forth. There has to be consultation where you're asking the stakeholders, what do you want to see as mitigation? And have that information gathering with the stakeholders, because the SHPO will ask point blank, what do the stakeholders think about this? And if you've just told them what you've come up with, that won't necessarily be sufficient. You could be in a scenario where your demographic, your community is not particularly engaged or involved, and that's fine. But just you have to make that effort of engaging with the stakeholders first before it gets to the SHPO level.
So I have found, we've been seeing these trends, especially the first point about that there must be a public benefit. And I think we also are kind of familiar with the second and third bullet, because that's also something that is required by CEQA, that there be a direct connection to the significance and that it be comparable, the mitigation be comparable to the impact. But I find that I get pushback from project proponents or from non-Caltrans lead agencies about really all three of those first points. And when we say, you know, oh, it's my read of SHPO, you know, that doesn't fly very much. I was so thrilled at the ADC 50 conference that I was at the last 2 days. One person shared a letter from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation to Nick SHPO from March of 2017 that essentially spells all that out. And it was raised because the state of Washington wanted to require funding toward an improved database system for their use, you know, to be housed by them and populated by them and so forth. And the project proponent who was trying to get out of that requirement essentially said there's no nexus, you know, the idea of the nexus between the mitigation you're suggesting and our project. And so state of Washington appealed to the Advisory Council for an opinion. And so this, you know, 2-page letter, just 2 sides of the same page, spells out a lot of these concepts and a lot of the concepts that those of us who are trying to get even more creative with mitigation can use as the basis for why it's okay. So it also speaks to, a lot of people say that like mitigation banking, for especially for built resources or for all cultural resources, wouldn't be viable because the nexus isn't direct enough. And there's language in here that essentially cautions you to think very hard about such things, that and says in no way should such mitigation lead to the impression that there is a quote unquote pay to play option for mitigation, you know, just cough up a bunch of money, you get to keep your project moving forward. But it does also establish that it could be viable. You know, if you're taking out an historic bridge and you're talking about coming up with a revolving fund for maintenance of other historic bridges in some relevant geography, that could be an acceptable mitigation. So I didn't have this before we sent out the materials, I just got it yesterday. But for those who aren't familiar with it, I'll turn this into a PDF and share it with John to share around with attendees. March 10th, 2017, from Advisory Council to Nick SHPO. Yeah, it may even be on Advisory Council's website. Yeah.
Great. Things you learn at conferences. That's great. Okay, so now we're just going to dive into some examples of recent mitigation to kind of get your creative juices flowing, but then also to show things that have recently been approved from the SHPO. So just to reiterate, HABs, HARE, HALS, well, very informative and useful and required under 4F if you use the Historic Bridge Programmatic. Just want to point that out. Is no longer sufficient. It can't be just HABs, HARE. That's not saying don't do HABs, HARE. Definitely don't, please don't interpret it in that way. But it's just no longer the sole mitigation that can go forward with built environment. Archaeological resources are typically captured under data recovery, so there'll be excavation and then analysis of whatever is recovered. Again, no longer sufficient. There needs to be some sort of public component unless tribal interests have indicated they do not want that for prehistoric sites, which is entirely plausible. So this goes more out to archaeologists, and maybe something you'll be talking about at tomorrow's workshop, but a big component of archaeological mitigation if it is a prehistoric site, has to be done with the tribes at the table and asking what their preferences are, because there may be a situation where they don't want data recovery, they may not want any sort of public component, and that has to be respected. And the SHPO was very clear on that, and also the Native American Heritage Commission, that if a tribe requests limited data recovery or no data recovery or no curation or whatever, that has to be part of the conversation. So if that is the situation, then you need to kind of get creative with whatever mitigation is proposed, or work in conjunction with the tribes to figure out something that is mutually beneficial for everybody. So that's the one caveat, my one asterisk for public benefit component. If it is a prehistoric tribal resource and they request that there not be public information, then that should be respected. Some additional mitigation concepts that have come up. Context-sensitive solutions. So that kind of goes back to what is the resource that's being affected. A project based on the historic property nature effects and consultation. Think outside of the box from the standard and go-to treatments we just discussed, and something towards something meaningful instead. So public outreach and interpretation. Plaques and interpretive displays have been are now kind of a new standard. So those are appropriate when appropriate. If you're talking about a rural bridge in the middle of nowhere and you put in an informational plaque in front of it that no one is going to see, that's not a net benefit for the public. So you have to think in terms of the context that your resource is located in and who your public is. If no one's ever going to see it, then perhaps something more like a website would be more appropriate, because then it's accessible to folks outside of the physical location of that resource. The smartphone apps are also becoming very popular. We had an internal Caltrans MOA PA training a few months ago, and SHPO staff were there, and they mentioned the Clio app is a new thing that a lot of people are using. And as soon as they said Clio, every single Caltrans staffer was like, write down Clio app. So I don't want to say that, and that now everyone add the Clio app to your mitigation list, but it is something that if it is, that's a unique resource where it's kind of a database of information that if you can keep adding things to this Clio app, where then basically it geo-references wherever you are with your phone and tells you what historic sites are nearby and gives you information. That's kind of like a banking situation where you're depositing information that presumably is pulled from your HAB's hair and from your content. CLIO. Yeah, right? Everybody writes it down. CLIO. But so that's something that, now I joke that the SHPO is going to push back on that because every project says it's going to have a Clio app. But it is a nice opportunity of compiling lots of information, and it could be something that is just a part of future mitigation. Now is we're going to always contribute whatever information we have to this almost repository of mitigation potentially. So just something to throw out there to think about. Publications like a thematic study or informational brochures produced as mitigation. This one on the right was the Cold Spring Canyon Bridge in Santa Barbara County when they installed the suicide barrier. It was an adverse effect. And so they produced this informational booklet based on their HRER and HAB's hair, and it was then handed out at local resources. There's a little tavern underneath the bridge that is really popular with tourists, and so they made it available there, and tourists could come in and pick it up, and it was really successful. Then some other alternative ideas. This goes a little bit to what Susan was just talking about. The dedicating money to purchase of a preservation easement or a preservation easement fund, donation to fund similar projects or preservation projects for similar resources. My example here on the bottom is in Santa Cruz County. There was a bridge replacement right down the road was a covered bridge that they wanted to repair or replace the cedar shingles. They didn't have enough money, so money was donated from one bridge project to fund that restoration effort. So again, it's not money from a bridge funding something totally unrelated. It was funding another bridge right down the road. So there was some sort of connection, the nexus that you're talking about. I also, during Steve's presentation, you mentioned the idea of kind of, and at your tour also, the idea of maintenance and how to have maintenance for both the Guerneville Bridge, but also the train station. So that's another potential opportunity, is to build that into your mitigation measure of some sort of maintenance fund or maintenance agreement that has to be established, especially for local projects where the local agency will be the responsible party of that resource, building in a maintenance agreement as a treatment measure to kind of make sure that that's captured in the future. This is a unique one. This is again for an archaeological site and actually a TCP, a traditional cultural property for Native Americans up near Reading. It was determined that there would be an adverse effect to the TCP that could be avoided by transplanting and replacing ethnobotanicals. So these are plants that the tribe had identified as significant to them culturally and ceremonially. So they moved the plants that were going to be impacted by the project and replanted them somewhere else. So they're still available and maintained accessible for the tribe. So that was an idea of kind of replanting ethnobotanicals as mitigation. And these are two bridge projects down in LA, the 6th Street Bridge up at the top left and the Schuyler Heim Bridge at the bottom. That really, this is, I think, an example of throwing the kitchen sink in terms of mitigation. They came up with amazing, really detailed mitigation. Is there anyone from GPA here? No. Someone online, yeah. So they could probably speak to it better. But so they, I'll just kind of list all the mitigation they came up with. So first they had mitigation to sell the bridge, make it available for sale. They had informational plaques. They did Habs hair. They built a website. They made a documentary film. They had traveling exhibits. They had a book on LA bridges. These are for two different projects. This is, but both of them had a lot of similar mitigation. And then what I think is probably the coolest is at the very end, after the bridge was getting demolished, they had kind of a public festival, and they made chunks of the bridge available to the public. So you could go and get your little artifact piece of the bridge, which I thought was pretty neat. So lots of different ideas there, and they threw a lot of different things out at them, and really kind of captured all the different kind of possibilities of mitigation. So, and these were a few years ago, so this was not even kind of under the current climate at SHPO, but great ideas to show a sliding scale of mitigation and what is appropriate for the scope and the impacts to these individual properties. So these are just some examples. By no means comprehensive and by no means the end-all be-all list, but just some things to take home with you and kind of encourage creative thinking. The more creative you get, the better response you're going to get from the SHPO specifically.
Yeah, just another couple of examples. One that I happen to be working on right now in the state of Texas, and then also one that I learned about at the conference yesterday that also is taking place in Texas and Oklahoma. So the one that I'm doing with Texas kind of ties back to the last module we presented about PAs for specific property types. So the state of Texas entered into a programmatic agreement with their SHPO for post-1945 bridges. And it essentially sets a hierarchy. It included doing a survey of all of the bridges in the state, and then all the post-1945 bridges, and then categorizing them A, B, or C. And all of the B and C bridges don't need to be considered any further in 106. So the districts will be able to do whatever they want to those bridges without another thought to 106. The Category A bridges are going to have a much higher bar, and anything that would be an adverse effect on them is going to require a lot of individual mitigation. But as part of that PA, SHPO really was, or THC, was really able to require TxDOT to do quite a bit of categorical mitigation, essentially. So, you know, the statewide context, the statewide inventory, but then also what we're putting together are a lot of social media content about TxDOT's role post-World War II through 1965 in basically entirely changing the transportation network of Texas. So it goes beyond just the message about, you know, box girder bridges and concrete slab bridges and what have you, to really getting out a better appreciation for how TxDOT contributed to the history of the state. And then the second one that I heard about was actually something that Mead and Hunt did for Department of Transportation in Oklahoma through negotiation with both Oklahoma's SHPO and I think it was mostly a brainchild of the Texas SHPO office, to recognize that the bridges across the Red River, which is the boundary between the two states, you know, are primarily from sort of the 1930s to the 1960s, and they all are needing either widening or replacement. And there were about 3 projects happening at about the same time. And what they ended up doing as a mitigation was a really nice coffee table style book, not just looking at those 3 bridges, but essentially looking at the history of crossing the Red River. And it is such an attractive document, and it really tells such a huge span of history. And I personally really like these projects that are going beyond just mitigating the lost history of an individual resource to helping make sure you're conveying to the public what that heritage was and is, and how it is still reflected in other ways on the landscape, and the story of that individual lost resource. But really getting to that idea of the appreciation for heritage resources as part of your end objective of your mitigation. Any thoughts? Any other mitigation projects that folks have seen or done that they feel kind of really get to a new idea, a new way of looking at mitigation?
The film on the PTC Center at the Packer Museum, and Desert Center, wasn't my project. I worked out there a lot. And so I've seen it develop over 10 years of solar project science and power line. And the film that is there now is much more of a public benefit than what was previously shown. It is also the only gas station restaurant with 90 miles away. So I mean, everyone stops there. You do have a separate, fee to get into the museum, but the statistician, it's an excellent piece of professional historical and archaeological work to show much more than anyone could possibly learn about that.
How do you make sure that whatever the mitigation is actually gets done?
Yeah, great question. Sure. So the way that our agreement documents are structured, previous documents were typically 10 years long, at a 10-year duration. And if mitigation was not complete within that 10 years, then they would have to be amended for time. Current agreement documents have a duration of 5 years. That's the current SHPO's preference, is 5 years. And they also now have an annual reporting requirement. So the project sponsor, whether it's Caltrans or the local agency, is required to submit an annual report of the current status of both the project and the treatment measures. That's really helped a lot, because that was an issue, especially with local projects where Caltrans was really just kind of the intermediary. We weren't able to be kept up to date on how mitigation was going. What's supposed to happen is when mitigation is complete, we then submit a kind of a completion letter to SHPO, closing the loop and saying everything is done. That doesn't always happen, and sometimes the agreement will just expire even though everything is completed. But if it expires and the treatment is not completed, it has to be amended. It doesn't just kind of disappear. That's usually how how the language is structured. Prior to the start of completion, the following treatment measures must be implemented. Yeah, and it may be that the actual mitigation measure, especially with archaeological resources, the data recovery has been completed, but the analysis is not until 12, 18 months later. But with built environment resources, pretty much it has to be done, obviously, any kind of documentation prior to construction. Yeah.
And I think in the Caltrans context, that works really well, because the cultural resources requirements, in the SIR are tied so closely to all the other resource requirements, and then that's tied to letting for construction and so forth. It's a little bit more challenging with some other agencies, and especially with the brave new world of design build. And so I think it becomes so much more important that we all be more aware of how project implementation actually happens, and the need for both what you are creating as commitments in a PA or an MOA are directly parallel to what's being created as commitments in the CEQA NEPA MMRPs, Mitigation Monitoring and Reporting Program, and that you understand well enough how all of that gets reflected in the contracting documents to make sure that they get reflected in the contracting documents, because honestly, that is something that is still a gap. And apparently it's happening nationwide. We had a whole session on it at the conference. Right. Yeah.
That's a great point too, that if there are other federal agencies that have permit requirements, like Army Corps specifically, they are typically also an invited signatory on the agreement. So they are looped in, they know exactly what's going on, and they will also hold up a permit exactly as you're describing.
So I'm going to try to reduce our last topic about nationwide exemptions to, almost 3 or 4 comments. Starting with a question. How many people are familiar that there is a nationwide exemption for the interstate highway system? Okay, I've got about half the people raise their hand. Of those, how many have applied it to a project? 0 hands. I know, me either, I don't think. I don't think. And then how many are familiar that there is, as of this week, I think, a draft final exemption for rail and rail transit properties? One who works with me and one who's also, and one online. So really quickly, where's the clicker? Is it that to move forward? Okay. Yes. So basically, there are ways to do exemptions from the 106 process at the national level. Alex referred to some and how it's applied sometimes at a state level. They are pretty rare. For linear resources, there have basically been 4. So National Gas Pipeline exemption for FERC, the Interstate Highway System exemption for FHWA, Big Creek transmission lines, again for FERC, and then the Historic Trails Programmatic Agreement. So if something's designated a historic trail, it's kind of seen as already recognized as a heritage resource and doesn't need to go through 106. The designation of it doesn't. So the Interstate Highway System exemption, tons of text here. Basically, what it established is that the whole interstate highway system is eligible. Thank you very much. Anything that you do to keep it in operation, no adverse effect. So you don't need to go through that whole process. We've already made that finding for you. It allowed states to identify a list of exceptions to the exemption. So maybe there's something that is individually eligible. Maybe there's something the state wants to always still have to treat as requiring going through Section 106. And really most states defined a very short list of individual elements of the interstate highway system that needed to be accepted from the exemption. Alex, do you happen to know in California how many we have?
There's 4.
4 components of the interstate highway system that are don't get to take advantage of this exemption from 106. So just a little history, you know, it took from 2005 till now really to be getting at these 2 exemptions for transportation related resources. The one that's about to come into play is, you know, a little bit controversial. And these exemptions both came about because of something that started at the US Congress level. And so really you could see a direct connection to a lobbying effort. And very much the case with the rail and rail transit exemption that is coming down the pike, that the federal rail entities wanted there to be an exemption from 106. So it worked its way through Congress. There was several studies done. My company, ICF, actually helped FTA and FRA with some of those studies. You know, our basic idea is, well, if they're congressionally mandated, they're going to happen. So we would like to be a part of making sure they're done as well as possible. So in 2015, Congress passed the FAST Act, which included a section that mandated that this exemption or program comment be developed. And in, I think it was November of last year, of 2017, the first draft was distributed by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation for public comment. It has been going through ACHP's process since then. And I just saw an email yesterday, I think it was, that the draft final is out for a final round of comment. So this is getting very close to being reality. So basically there are 2 things that the exemption will establish: that there are minor activities that will be exempted from all review, and that includes routine maintenance, capacity improvements within the existing right-of-way, upgrades for safety or operations. I think that one has the potential to be used most broadly by the rail company. And then changes in transportation use, which honestly, I don't understand that one very well myself.
Was that conversion to
Probably. Yeah. And I don't know why that would be exempted, but there we go. And then the exceptional historic properties approach. So the interesting thing here is that it will be up to each of the rail or transit entities to identify which are their exceptional historic properties. And it means what they want it to mean. Yeah, which I think is what has some of the preservation professionals and preservation advocates nervous about this one. I know like the the Colorado DOT folks, they are not excited about this exemption because, you know, their rail heritage is so iconic for them. And I don't think it's linked to level. I think that there is an element of if something is already listed in the National Register, then it should be considered an exceptional historic property. But mostly it's each entity. So like, you know, BART or the you know, San Antonio District of Light Rail, you know, each of these agencies will need to come up with their own list or say, we see no exceptional resources. And then their whole system is exempt from 106.
And this was last year. I thought that they were going to be providing some guidance for the project sponsors on how to apply.
I'm sure, oops.
You know,
There we go. I'm sure that is the intention.
was that still, have you been seeing or hearing any of that?
I have not. And I think FRA and FTA, you know, FRA has a pretty robust cultural resources program at the DC, at the headquarters level. FTA, a bit less so. They basically have a federal preservation officer and then some contract vehicles to get to consultants sometimes when they're well funded, which has not been in the past couple of years. So I think that is going to be the big mystery. And why I wanted it to be one of the topics that we have today. I don't have a lot to tell you as far as answers. I just wanted to make sure that folks who are participating in a CPF workshop have awareness. And to keep an eye out as the notifications come about, you know, for example, the draft final exemption being out for final review. And to, you know, to offer up these kind of questions to the agencies or to your representatives or what have you, you know, release an exemption like this and not knowing what the guidance is about how to implement it is, you know, I think something worth talking about. Yes, within existing right-of-way. For the minor activities. And I guess, I mean, any of it would, if it is a resource that they own and operate, that would, I assume, be within existing right-of-way as well for the exceptional resources.
Susan, is there any concurrence level for when the agency determines what are their exceptional historic properties?
Yes, so the if an agency comes up with a list of their exceptional historic properties, they are supposed to coordinate that with SHPO. I think that the version I saw of it and the conversations I've been hearing, it's less clear about whether the agency has to have an equivalent of concurrence from SHPO before treating their whole system as exempt except for those resources. It seems to be very much driven by the agencies themselves. Yeah. So, food for thought and discussion. Something to be aware of, you know, in the coming years of our practice. Yeah. Okay, Chad, I think it's your turn. Sorry.
Oh, really?